Something in the ocean blocked our path home for over 4 hours, and not one of us on that deck believed for a single second that it was an accident. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how it sounds. I've had 50 years to think about how it sounds, and I still don't have a better way to say it. So I'm just going to say it plainly and let you do what you want with it. My name is Daniel Marsh. I spent the better part of 3 decades working deep water survey expeditions, and I am not a man who frightens easily. And I am not a man who exaggerates. And what I'm about to tell you happened exactly the way I'm going to tell it. Every person who was out there with me would say the same thing. Most of them are gone now. That's the part that finally pushed me to write this down. I kept thinking, somebody has to hold this straight while they still can. So here I am. It started the way all the worst things start, which is quietly, and with a completely reasonable explanation that turns out to be wrong. We were several hundred miles off the northwest coast, working a deep water survey contract. 9 of us on the vessel, plus a second crew on a larger ship about a mile north, running parallel operations. The kind of work where you deploy sensor equipment at depth, monitor through the night in rotating shifts, pull it back at dawn, and log what you've got. Routine. Repetitive. The kind of job that gets meditative after the first few days, where the rhythm of the ocean starts to feel like something you're part of, rather than something you're sitting on top of. The water out there has a particular smell that I've never been able to describe properly to anyone who hasn't been far enough offshore to know it. It's not the salt and seaweed smell of a harbor or a beach. It's older than that. Colder. Like the ocean is breathing out something from very deep down, and you're just close enough to catch it. I remember standing on deck that first evening, watching the equipment go over the side and thinking, I love this. The low hum of the winch, the cable unspooling into black water. The way the cold came off the surface and settled into your collar no matter how well you'd layered up. I genuinely loved it. I want you to know that because it matters for what comes later. The man running our operation was named Victor Hale, late 50s, former naval background. The kind of stillness in a crisis that makes you want to physically stand near him just to borrow some of it. He had a phrase he used when crew members started getting jumpy on long voyages, which was that the ocean was just water and physics and weather, and everything else was the mind-filling silence with noise. He said it with the confidence of someone who had been proven right enough times that he'd stopped seriously considering the alternative. I respected that about him. I respected it right up until the moment I watched it stop being true. The first 3 days were everything they were supposed to be. Good data, clean recoveries, decent sleep, and short stretches. The kind of run where you think, all right, this one's going to go smoothly. Patrick, who'd been doing this longer than any of us, said on the 3rd evening that the grounds felt good to him. Patrick wasn't a superstitious man, but he had what I can only call a professional intuition about deep water. A kind of low-level reading of conditions that 20 years of offshore work builds in a person, whether they want it or not. When Patrick said a location felt good, it usually meant the next few days would be straightforward. He said that on the 3rd evening. By the 4th morning, the first piece of equipment came back wrong. Not broken, not malfunctioning. Wrong. The sensor housing was intact, the cable was intact, but the casing along one face had been deformed, pressed inward along a smooth curve, the way something enormous and flat presses against a surface with slow, even weight. The data it had logged showed a low-frequency acoustic signal from directly below, stronger than anything in our baseline readings, and then a gap. And then, nothing. Victor looked at it for a long time. Then he said it was consistent with marine mammal contact, and wrote that in the log, and told us to prep the replacement unit. His voice was normal. His hands were steady. And every one of us standing around that recovered housing nodded and got back to work, because the explanation he was offering was the only one any of us wanted to take home that day. But here's the thing about an explanation you don't quite believe. It doesn't disappear. It just sits in the back of your mind and waits. And every small thing that happens after it, your mind connects to it automatically, quietly, without asking your permission. I went through that whole day connecting things I didn't want connected. The way the water looked different to the south of us in the afternoon light, the sound the hull made in the night that wasn't the engine and wasn't the waves. The fact that 2 other crew members had separately stopped sleeping well, and neither of them had said why. I didn't say anything either. None of us did. Not yet. If this kind of story does something to you, if it gets under your skin the way it's gotten under mine for 50 years, go ahead and subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps, and there's a lot more where this came from. I've told this story in my head more times than I can count, always starting at different points, trying to find the place where things actually went wrong. For a long time, I thought it started with the damaged equipment. Then I thought it started the night before that, when I was alone on monitoring duty and heard something I didn't report. Now I think it started before either of those things. I think it started the moment we put our equipment into that particular stretch of water, and something down there noticed the disturbance. I don't know how deep it was when it first registered us. I don't know what we felt like to it. From that distance, in that darkness, 9 people on a metal hull, machinery running, cables dropping into its territory. Maybe we felt like noise. Maybe we felt like something more specific than that. I genuinely don't know. What I know is that whatever was down there, it had been down there a very long time, and it had seen things come and go from that water before, and it had a way of responding to intrusions that had nothing to do with panic or aggression. It had patience. That's what I eventually understood. It had patience the way only something very old and very large can have patience. The kind that doesn't need to hurry because it knows, with complete certainty, that time is on its side. The night I was on solo monitoring duty, I was below deck at the instrument station. The rest of the crew was sleeping in shifts. The vessel was moving the way a vessel moves in calm, deep water, a slow, low roll that gets into your bones after a few days and starts to feel like the ship breathing. I had a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, and a logbook open in front of me, and about 4 hours left on my shift. The acoustic sensor picked up the signal at 2:15 in the morning. I remember the exact feeling of seeing it on the readout, that specific quality of wrongness you get when something appears where the baseline says nothing should be. It was low frequency, deep, coming from directly beneath the hull. Not a geological reading, not mechanical interference. Something that pulsed slowly, diffusely, the way water sounds when something very large moves through it with great care. I ran the diagnostic check. Everything was functioning correctly. I ran it again. Same result. The signal was real, and it was close, and it was big enough to register clearly on equipment designed to detect subtle variations in deep water acoustics. I sat there for probably 2 full minutes, just looking at it. Then I flagged it for morning review, wrote a single line in the log, and told myself it was almost certainly a deep current running against the hull in some unusual configuration. I closed the logbook. I drank the cold coffee. I watched the readout for another hour, and the signal faded, and by the time my shift ended, the baseline looked normal again. I did not call Victor. I keep coming back to that. I keep thinking about that 2-minute window where I sat looking at the readout and chose the explanation that cost me nothing professionally over the one that might have cost us all less later. I was 29 years old. I wanted to be the kind of crew member who didn't raise alarms over things that could be explained away. I wanted Victor to think well of me. I've had 50 years to think about that decision. I don't spend a lot of time on regret as a general rule, but that one I've kept. Not because I think it would have changed the outcome, honestly. I'm not sure anything we did or didn't do would have changed the outcome, but because it was the first moment I made a choice based on what I wanted to be true rather than what was in front of me. And out there, in deep water that far from shore, that is a very specific kind of mistake to make. The next morning, the equipment came up wrong, and Victor offered his explanation, and all of us took it, and none of us slept as well that night as we had the night before, though no one said so until much later, when we were comparing notes and found that all 9 of us had lain in our bunks listening to the hull and waiting, without knowing exactly what we were waiting for. The second piece of equipment came up wrong the very next morning, and this time Victor didn't say anything for almost 3 full minutes. That silence told me more than any explanation he could have offered. I'd worked with the man long enough to know his rhythms. Victor processed things quickly. He looked, he assessed, he spoke. That was his pattern, and it had been his pattern every day of the 4 expeditions I'd done under his leadership. 3 minutes of silence from Victor Hale was the equivalent of open panic from anyone else. The deformation on the second casing was longer than the first, more deliberate somehow, if that word can apply to physical damage. The curve pressed into the metal ran nearly the full length of the housing, and it was smoother than the first one, more even in its pressure. Like whatever had made contact had done so more slowly this time, more carefully. I remember running my fingers along it and feeling how cold the metal was, colder than the air, colder than it should have been after sitting in the recovery bin for 20 minutes. And thinking that was strange and then deciding not to think about it. Victor finally said that the marine mammal theory still held. He said it without his usual confidence, just the words themselves, flat and functional, like a tool he was using because it was the only one available. Nobody pushed back, but nobody agreed out loud either, which was new. The day before, we'd all nodded. That morning, we just got on with the work, and the silence between us had a different texture than it had had the day before. Patrick caught my eye across the deck and held it for a second. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Patrick had a way of communicating entire conversations through a single look, and what that look said was, "You and I both know what this isn't." What made that morning worse was the radio call that came in around mid-morning from Claire Okafor on the northern vessel. I was near the communications station when Victor took it, close enough to hear both sides clearly. Claire was describing damage to one of her team's deployed units. Same type of deformation, she said. Same smooth curve. Same even pressure distribution along the casing. She used careful language, the language of someone who was being precise because she didn't want to say the thing she was actually thinking. Victor asked her twice whether she thought marine mammal contact was a reasonable explanation. The first time she said she couldn't rule it out. The second time, after a pause that stretched long enough to fill with static, she said the same thing again, word for word. Not because she agreed, because it was the only answer that kept the situation manageable, and both of them knew it. After the call ended, Victor stood at the chart table for a while, not doing anything, just standing there with his hands flat on the surface, looking at our position. I watched him from across the room and thought about how much of leadership in a situation like that is just the performance of certainty. The way a crew takes its emotional temperature from whoever is in charge. Victor understood that. He'd always understood it. He straightened up, turned around, and assigned the afternoon tasks in a completely normal voice. And everyone went off to do their work, and that was that. Except that evening, for the first time, he changed the watch rotation. Instead of solo overnight monitoring, he put people in pairs. He didn't explain why. He just posted the revised schedule on the board and left it there. I looked at it for a long time after he walked away. A small change. A quiet change. The kind of change that says everything without saying anything at all. That night, paired on the monitoring shift with a crew member named Renee, I sat in the instrument station and listened to the ocean. The acoustic readings were clean. The baseline held steady. Nothing appeared on the sensors that required logging. Renee and I didn't talk much. The vessel moved in its slow, deep-water roll, and the equipment hummed. And outside the small porthole to my left, the water was black and completely still. At some point around 3 a.m, Renee said quietly that she'd been thinking about the pressure curves on the casings. She had an engineering background, more technical than most of us, and she'd done her own rough calculations during her off hours. She said that based on the surface area of the deformation and the depth at which the equipment had been deployed, the force required to produce that specific curve was considerably beyond what any documented marine species could generate through simple body contact. I asked her how far beyond. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked back at the readout. Then she said she'd rather not put a number on it until she'd checked her math again. She never did share that number with me. I don't know whether she checked the math and found it was wrong, or whether she checked it and found it was right, and decided that some numbers are better kept to yourself when you're still several hundred miles from shore with 3 days of the contract left to run. I never asked her directly. There are things you don't ask on a long voyage, because asking them makes them more real. And there are moments when keeping something slightly unreal is the only thing that gets you through the next shift. The following morning, the northern vessel lost an entire deployment rig. Not damaged, not deformed, gone. The anchor line was intact all the way to the shackle at the bottom, and the shackle itself had been opened, not cut, opened. The metal bent back on itself the way you'd bend a paperclip if you had unlimited patience and absolutely no concern about time. The rig had been worth a considerable amount of money, and it had been anchored at depth with equipment rated for conditions far more extreme than anything we were operating in. And something had simply taken it. Claire Okafor reported this to Victor in the same careful, controlled voice she'd used the morning before. Victor thanked her and said he'd include it in the joint incident report. When the call ended, he sat down, which I had never seen him do in the middle of a working day. He just sat down in the chair at the communications station and put both hands in his lap and looked at the middle distance for about 30 seconds. Then he stood up and walked to the porthole and looked out at the water to the south of us. I don't know what he was looking for. I don't think he knew either. But whatever it was, he stood there looking for it for a long time. And when he finally turned back around, his face had that quality I'd first noticed 2 days earlier and was starting to recognize more clearly now. Not fear exactly, Something more like the expression a person gets when they've been solving a problem using a method that worked every time before, and they've just realized, quietly and with complete certainty, that the method has stopped working. He didn't say anything to the rest of us that morning. He just gave us our tasks and let the day continue. But that night, when I went past his cabin on my way to the monitoring station, I could see light under the door. It was past midnight. Victor Hale, who slept 6 hours without exception on every voyage I'd ever done with him, was awake at past midnight, alone in his cabin, with the light on. And outside, in the deep water around us, something that had already taken a piece of equipment worth more than most people earn in a year was still out there, doing whatever it was doing in the dark. By the 5th day, 3 of us had stopped going to the lower deck alone after dark, and none of us had said a word to each other about it. That's the thing about collective fear on a small vessel far from shore. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come in through the front door. It seeps in under the edges, slow and quiet, the way cold water finds the gap in a seal you didn't know was worn. You don't decide to be afraid. You just notice one day that you've been rearranging your habits around something you haven't named yet. I noticed it in myself first. I'd started taking the long way around the deck to reach the monitoring station, the route that kept me in lit areas longer. I told myself it was just preference. Then I noticed Renee was doing something similar, always pausing at the top of the lower deck stairs for just a half second before going down. The way you pause before stepping into a room where you think someone might be waiting. And then there was Marcus, our equipment specialist, who had taken to doing his evening calibration checks 10 minutes earlier than his schedule required, consistently finishing before the light fully went off the water. Nobody said anything about any of it. We just moved through our days with these small adjustments built in. And the adjustments told the truth that our mouths weren't ready to tell yet. The hull vibration came back on the 5th night. I felt it first through the floor of the monitoring station, a low pulse that moved up through the soles of my boots and into my legs before I even consciously registered what it was. Not mechanical, not engine-related. I knew every vibration this vessel produced under power and at rest, and this wasn't any of them. It came at irregular intervals, slow and deep, like a very large heartbeat from somewhere far below, traveling up through water and steel to find us. I put my hand flat on the console and felt it there too, faint but unmistakable, a rhythm with no source I could point to in any instrument reading. I logged it this time. After what Renee had said about her calculations, after the missing rig, after Victor sitting down in the middle of a working day, I was done making comfortable decisions. I wrote exactly what I felt, when I felt it, for how long, and how it compared to mechanical vibration. Then I flagged it for morning review and stayed at the console for the rest of my shift, with my hand periodically returning to the surface to check whether it was still there. It was still there at 2 in the morning. It was still there at 3. By 4, it had faded, or I'd stopped being able to separate it from the ordinary movement of the vessel. I don't know which. In the morning, without any arrangement between us, 4 crew members mentioned the vibration at breakfast. Not to Victor specifically, just into the general conversation, the way you mention something when you're testing whether other people experienced it too. Marcus had felt it in his bunk through the mattress. Renee had felt it through the wall of the lower corridor. A younger crew member named Joel, who I hadn't pegged as particularly sensitive to this kind of thing, said he'd felt it in his hands while he was working on the equipment, and initially thought something was wrong with his tools. 4 people, 4 different locations on the vessel. 4 completely consistent accounts of the same thing. Victor was at the table when this happened. He listened to all of it without expression. Then he asked each of us, one at a time, to describe the intervals. We each described them the same way. Irregular, but slow. Slower than breathing, faster than wave action. He nodded once after the last account, picked up his coffee and took a drink, and looked out the porthole at the water. Then he said he'd review the hull sensor logs from the night. He said it calmly. He said it like a man who already knew what he was going to find and was performing the review because procedure required it, and because procedure was the last solid thing he had to stand on. He reviewed those logs for a long time that morning, alone in the instrument station. When he came out, he didn't share what he'd found. He just said the hull readings were being added to the incident file and moved on to the daily task assignments. I found out later from Renee, who'd managed to glance at the open log on his screen, that the sensor data showed a recurring low-frequency pressure event from directly beneath the keel, depth unspecified, consistent across all hull sensor points simultaneously. Not a localized contact. Something generating pressure across the full width of the vessel from below, like the water itself was being displaced, very slowly, by something enormous passing underneath us. Not touching us, just passing underneath. Very slowly. Very close. That detail, when Renee told me, produced a specific feeling I don't have a clean word for. Not panic. Something quieter and worse than panic. The feeling of understanding that something very large had been under your feet, repeatedly, through the night, and had chosen not to do anything about it. The passiveness of that was somehow more disturbing than any aggressive act would have been. An aggressive act you can respond to. A thing that simply moves beneath you and watches and waits, gives you nothing to push back against. That afternoon, Claire Okafor requested a joint communication between both vessels and both full crews. Victor agreed. The call was set for early evening, and for the first time since the expedition had started, the mood on board before a scheduled event felt like the mood before something you can't prepare for. People moved quietly. Conversation stopped a beat earlier than usual. Joel spent an hour on the rear deck, just sitting and looking at the water, which was not something Joel typically did. I stood near him for part of that hour, without talking. The ocean to the south was flat and gray and gave away nothing. Whatever was down there, out of sight, doing whatever it did in the dark between its slow passes beneath us. The call started at early evening, both crews on open channel, and Claire Okafor spoke first. She said she wanted to share something her crew had compiled from their observation logs over the past 3 days. She said she was going to read it straight, and she wanted everyone to listen before anyone responded. What she read took about 4 minutes. When she finished, the channel was silent for long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. Then Victor said, very quietly, that he needed everyone to hear this clearly. And what he said next was the moment I understood that we were not going to simply finish the contract and go home. On the 3rd day of our expedition, without any coordination between the 2 vessels, both crews had independently begun logging the creature's position relative to the ships during each observation. They had done this separately, using different methods, different crew members, different timing. When Claire's team overlaid their positional logs against ours, the pattern that emerged was clean and deliberate and impossible to explain as coincidence. In every single observation across both vessels over 3 days, the creature had never once positioned itself between the two ships. Not once. Not by accident. Not approximately. Never. It was always to the outside of us, the north or south or east or west, but never in the gap between the two vessels. Never in the space where it would have been visible to both crews simultaneously. It had maintained that consistency across dozens of independent sightings spanning 3 full days. Claire let that sit for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, that this implied a level of spatial awareness she wasn't prepared to attribute to any marine species in the existing literature. Nobody responded for almost 30 seconds. And in that silence, with the flat gray ocean sitting outside every porthole on both ships, something shifted permanently in the way I understood what we were dealing with. Because there is a very clear line between an animal that reacts to its environment and a thing that tracks, maps, and deliberately manages its position relative to multiple objects it is aware of as a group. We had just crossed that line, and there was no crossing back. That evening, after Claire finished reading and the channel went quiet, Victor did something I had never seen him do in 4 expeditions together. He asked the crew for their opinion. Not in those words. He framed it as a briefing, a professional assessment of operational risk in light of the compiled data. But I had worked with this man long enough to understand what was underneath the framing. Victor Hale, who had 30 years of deep-water decisions behind him, and who had never once, in my experience, needed to know what a junior crew member thought before making a call, was asking because he genuinely didn't know what to do. And that, more than anything that had happened in the previous 5 days, made the cold feeling in my chest settle in and stay. We gathered in the main cabin, 9 of us on our vessel, and Claire's crew joined by open radio channels so their voices came through the speaker on the wall. Victor laid out the compiled observation data without commentary, just the facts, the equipment losses, the pressure events, the acoustic signals, the positional pattern Claire's team had identified. He read it the way you read a technical report, steady and without inflection. When he finished, he said he wanted to hear from anyone who had information or perspective that wasn't already in the file. The first person to speak was Patrick. He said he'd been doing deep water work for over 2 decades, and he'd seen whale behavior, shark behavior, giant squid interaction with equipment, the full range of large marine animal encounters that this kind of work produces. He said that none of those categories fit what we had documented. He said it simply, without drama, the way Patrick said everything. Then he said he thought we should finish the data collection and leave as scheduled in 2 days, because changing course without completing the contract had practical consequences, and because whatever was out there had not made any move toward the vessel itself. That last point sat in the room for a moment. He was right. 5 days in, with all the equipment damage and the hull vibrations and the positional tracking, the creature had not once come toward either vessel with anything resembling intent. It had passed beneath us. It had taken equipment deployed at depth. It had observed us, but it had not touched the ships. Patrick's argument was essentially that as long as that line held, the risk was manageable. Joel, who was the youngest of us by several years, said quietly from his corner that he wasn't sure he trusted the line to hold. Nobody disagreed with him. Nobody agreed either. The room just held both things at once, the way rooms do when the truth is uncomfortable enough that taking sides feels premature. Victor listened to all of it. Then he said he was going to make a decision in the morning after reviewing the overnight sensor data, and that until then, the watch rotations would continue as posted, and everyone should get whatever rest they could. He said this in a tone that closed the meeting without formally closing it, and people drifted off to their bunks or their stations in ones and twos, and the vessel settled back into its nighttime rhythms. I stayed in the main cabin after the others left. Victor was still at the table, going through the positional logs Claire had transmitted, cross-referencing them against our own. I made 2 cups of coffee and put one near his elbow without saying anything. He picked it up and drank without looking away from the papers. After a few minutes, he said, without preamble, that the positional data was the part that bothered him most. Not the equipment loss, not the acoustic signals, not even the hull vibrations. The positional data. Because equipment loss had explanations, unlikely ones, but explanations. And acoustic signals had explanations. But an animal that consistently and deliberately avoids the space between 2 vessels over a period of 3 days across dozens of independent observations in varying light and sea conditions does not have an explanation. Not a clean one. Not one that fits into any behavioral model he had ever worked with. He didn't look at me when he said any of this. He just kept his eyes on the logs and spoke in a low, even voice. And I understood that he wasn't looking for a response. He was thinking out loud in the only way he knew how to do it, which was to say the thing plainly to another person and let it exist in the air for a moment before putting it away again. I drank my coffee and said nothing. Outside, the ocean was dark and flat and perfectly still. The morning sensor logs showed 2 more pressure events from beneath the keel, both occurring in the hours just before dawn. Longer than the previous ones. Slower. The low-frequency acoustic signal had also returned on the overnight readings, stronger this time, and it had persisted for nearly 90 minutes before fading. Victor reviewed all of it before the rest of the crew was fully awake. When people came to breakfast, he was already at the chart table with the return route mapped out. He told us we were leaving the following morning. He said it without explanation, without the professional framing he'd used the night before, without the careful language of operational risk assessment. He just said it the way you say a fact that doesn't require context. We're leaving tomorrow morning. The contract would be settled. The remaining data collection targets would be logged as incomplete due to operational safety concerns. He'd already drafted the communication to the contracting office. Claire Okafor, when Victor raised her on the radio, said her crew had reached the same conclusion independently, and she was ready to depart on the same schedule. Nobody on either vessel objected. Nobody needed a moment to think about it. The decision fell into place the way decisions do, when everyone involved has already made it privately, and is simply waiting for someone to say it out loud. What happened next was the part that nobody planned for, and the part I've thought about longest in the years since. The departure preparations began immediately. Equipment was recovered, data was secured, systems were run through pre-departure checks. It was organized and efficient, and should have taken the rest of the day. It took longer than that. Not because of any single problem, but because of a dozen small ones. The kind that come from people operating on too little sleep, with too much of their attention on the water around them, rather than the task in front of them. A calibration sequence run incorrectly and needing to be repeated. A storage housing sealed wrong and having to be reopened. Tools set down and not immediately found again. By late afternoon, it was clear we would not be ready before dark. Victor made the call to hold overnight and run at first light. He made it quickly, without the hesitation I might have expected given everything that had preceded it. In retrospect, I think he made it quickly because he knew if he sat with it for more than a few seconds, he might make a different call. And a different call, running an unfamiliar heading in the dark, with a crew at this level of exhaustion, carried its own serious risks. So we held. We ate dinner. We ran the evening watch rotation. We did all the ordinary things that structure a working day on a survey vessel. And the structure helped, the way structure always helps when the alternative is standing still with your thoughts. I took the early overnight monitoring shift. The instrument station was quiet. The readings were clean. I logged the time at intervals the way I always did, and drank my coffee, and told myself that one more night was one more night, and morning would come the same way it always did. At 11 minutes past 9 that evening, the shape appeared on the surface to the east of us. Not at depth this time. Not as a pressure reading or an acoustic signal or a displacement pattern in the water. On the surface. Visible. Moving. I had my hand on the radio before I had consciously decided to reach for it. It was longer than our vessel. I understood that within the first few seconds of looking at it, and our vessel was over 90 feet from bow to stern. I don't know how to properly explain what it feels like to look at something in open water and understand, in your body before your mind has finished processing it, that it is larger than the structure you are standing on. There's a specific quality to that realization. It doesn't arrive as a thought. It arrives as a physical sensation, somewhere between cold and falling. A kind of sudden wrongness in the relationship between yourself and the world around you. I stood at the porthole of the instrument station and felt that sensation move through me from the feet up. And then I had the radio in my hand and was calling Victor before I had made any conscious decision to do so. I said his name twice. He answered on the second call, his voice alert in a way that told me he hadn't been sleeping. I told him there was something on the surface to the east. I told him it was large. I told him it was close. I said all of this in a voice I was consciously trying to keep level, and I mostly succeeded, except for the last part, where the word close came out slightly wrong, slightly too tight, in a way that I heard as soon as I said it. Victor said he was coming up. I stayed at the porthole while I waited. The shape was moving north, slowly, with that quality of effortless, unhurried mass that I had only ever seen before in the brief glimpses at depth, and seeing it at the surface was categorically different. At depth it was frightening because of what it implied. At the surface it was frightening because of what it simply was. The moonlight caught the displacement around it, a long, low ridge of pushed water moving ahead of its bulk, and the surface on either side of it was flat and still, in a way that seemed almost wrong, like the ocean itself was being careful not to disturb whatever was moving through it. Patrick arrived on deck before Victor. He came through the hatch and stood beside me without saying anything, and we both watched it move north until it passed the line of our bow and continued beyond what we could clearly see. Then Victor was behind us, and then Marcus and Renee, and then Joel. And within about 4 minutes, all 9 of us were on deck in the cold night air watching the eastern water. Claire's voice came over the handheld radio Victor was carrying. Her crew had spotted it too, from their position a mile north. She said it had passed within roughly 300 feet of her vessel's starboard side. She said this in a steady voice with a very slight quality underneath it that I recognized as the sound of someone keeping themselves steady by force of will rather than by feeling steady. She described what she could see from her position. Her description matched what we were seeing from ours. Nobody talked much. There wasn't a lot to say. You can fill silence with words when you're processing something that fits into existing categories. something surprising or upsetting that language already has a shape for. This didn't fit any shape. So we stood and watched, and the cold came off the water and settled into our clothes, and the only sounds were the low work of the vessel's systems and the ocean moving against the hull, and occasionally the very faint sound of displacement from the north, where the shape was continuing whatever path it had decided to take. It completed the first full circuit in 40 minutes. I know because Patrick timed it, watch in hand, standing at the rail with the same attentive stillness he brought to every problem he'd ever worked through in his career. He announced the time without emotion and started timing the second circuit immediately. The shape came around from the north back to the east, then south, then west, then east again. A full loop around both vessels together, not around one and then the other, around both of them simultaneously, as if the two ships together were the object it was circling, as if it had a clear understanding of the two-vessel cluster as a single thing to be mapped. The second circuit took 37 minutes. It was closer. Not dramatically closer, not a sudden aggressive approach, just measurably, precisely closer. The displacement ridge more visible, the pressure vibration through the hull more consistent and sustained. Renee looked at me during the second circuit with an expression I had not seen on her face before, and Renee was one of the most technically composed people I have ever worked with. It wasn't panic. It was something more specific than panic. It was the expression of a person whose mental model of what is possible has just been exceeded, and who is standing very still while they work out what to replace it with. Joel sat down on the deck at some point during the second circuit, not because he was injured or unwell. He just sat down, with his back against the housing, and drew his knees up and watched from there. Nobody said anything about it. I understood it completely. There are moments when sitting down is the most honest physical response available. Patrick announced the second circuit time when it completed. Then he said very quietly that it was tightening. Not a question, an observation, stated for the record, the way Patrick stated everything. Because in his view, facts needed to be said out loud, even when nobody wanted to hear them. Victor had not spoken since coming on deck. He stood at the rail with the radio in one hand and watched the shape complete its second loop, and when it came around to the east again and began the third pass, he raised Claire on the radio and told her to keep her crew on deck and keep the channel open. Claire said, "Already done." Her voice was very quiet. The third circuit was tighter still. The displacement waves reached our hull now, not violently, not with any sense of force or aggression, just present, physical, a gentle rolling that had no business being there on a calm night with no wind. It felt like being nudged, very slowly, by something so large that nudging was the smallest gesture available to it. And then the third circuit ended, and the shape didn't begin a fourth. It moved south, deliberately, smoothly, without any change in its unhurried pace. It left the circular path it had been holding and moved to a position directly south of both vessels, the direction we needed to go, the heading home. And it stopped there. Claire's voice came over the radio, barely above a murmur. She said it was due south of her vessel. Victor said it was due south of ours. Then neither of them said anything else because there was nothing else to say that the ocean wasn't already saying for itself. 17 people across 2 vessels stood in the dark and looked south at the shape in the water and understood, without discussion, without any formal acknowledgement that the way home was occupied. I looked at Victor's face at that moment. In 30 years of deep water work, he had managed storms, equipment failures, medical emergencies. One situation I will not describe in detail that required him to make a choice with no good options and to live with that choice afterward. I had seen this man's face under pressure more times than I could count. I had never seen it look the way it looked right then. Not afraid. Something older than afraid. Something that doesn't have a clean name in any language I know, but that every person on that deck was feeling in some version of their own. We were being held. Not physically. Not by any force we could push against or reason with or document in a technical report. Just held by the simple, absolute fact of something enormous sitting between us and the direction we needed to go, and the complete absence of any indication that it intended to move. It held that position for 4 hours and 23 minutes. I know because I never stopped watching, and I never stopped counting. I want you to understand what those hours were actually like, because I think when people hear a story like this, they imagine it as a series of dramatic moments stacked against each other, one intense scene after another. That's not what it was. What it was 4 hours and 23 minutes of standing on a deck in the cold and watching something that wasn't moving and didn't have to. The drama was in the stillness. The pressure was in the waiting. Every minute that passed without the shape moving was its own kind of statement, and the statement accumulated, and by the second hour it had accumulated into something that sat on all of us differently, but sat on all of us completely. Patrick stood at the rail for most of it. He didn't time anything after the circuits ended because there was nothing to time. He just stood there in his usual way, attentive and measuring, like a man reading weather. I've thought about Patrick a lot in the years since. He was the most practically grounded person I've ever worked with, and his way of being grounded was to treat every situation as a problem that had a correct response if you stayed calm enough to find it. I watched him that night look for the correct response for 4 hours and not find it, and I watched what that did to him, which was almost nothing on the outside and probably everything on the inside. That was Patrick. He held his shape even when the shape had nothing useful left to do. Marcus sat on an equipment crate at around the second hour and didn't stand back up. He wasn't collapsed or distressed in any obvious way. He was just done standing. He sat and watched from the crate with his arms resting on his knees and his eyes on the south, and occasionally he'd look down at his hands for a moment and then look back up. I understood that too. When there's nothing you can do with your hands, and nothing your hands are being asked to do, your hands become very strange to you. They feel unnecessary. That's an odd feeling for a working person. Renee did something I wouldn't have predicted. About 90 minutes in, she went below and came back with her personal notebook, a small one she used for technical observations, and she started writing in it. Not instrument readings, not data. I could see from where I stood that she was writing in longer lines than notation requires. She was writing the experience down as it was happening, sitting on a coil of cable with the notebook balanced on her knee, her pen moving in the dark by the light coming from the porthole behind her. I don't know if she still has that notebook, I never asked. But I've always thought that was one of the most quietly courageous things I saw anyone do that night. She decided the thing needed to be recorded, and she recorded it, right there in the middle of it. while the rest of us were just trying to get through each next minute. Victor stood at the stern rail and didn't speak for the full 4 hours, except when Claire came over the radio. Claire called twice, once at roughly the first hour mark, and once at roughly the third. Both times she said simply that the shape was still holding position to the south. Both times Victor acknowledged. That was the full extent of communication between the two vessels for most of that night. There wasn't anything else to say. The ocean to the south was saying it all, and everyone on both decks was listening. Joel fell asleep at some point in the third hour. Not dramatically, not by collapsing. He was sitting with his back against the housing, the same position he'd taken during the circling. And at some point his head went down and his breathing changed and he was simply asleep. I noticed because I happened to look over at exactly the right moment. Nobody woke him. I made a quiet decision not to. He was 24 years old, and this was his third extended offshore assignment. And if his body had found a way to step out of those 4 hours, even briefly, then that was something to protect rather than interrupt. I thought a lot during that time. Not productive thoughts, not problem-solving or risk assessment. The kind of thinking that happens when your conscious mind runs out of useful work and starts moving through rooms in your memory that you don't normally visit. I thought about the first time I went offshore at 19. How enormous and indifferent the ocean had seemed. How I'd stood at the rail on my first overnight transit and felt the specific smallness that comes from being on a vessel in open water at night with no land in any direction. I had filed that feeling away as something to get used to, a temporary discomfort that experience would dissolve. And experience had dissolved it, year by year, until the ocean had started to feel familiar in the way all deeply known things feel familiar. Still powerful, still demanding respect, but known, navigable, manageable by the right preparation and the right decisions. What I felt that night, watching that shape hold its position to the south of us, was the original feeling coming back. Not the managed version, the original version, the 19-year-old version. Except deeper, because I was older now, and I understood more precisely what I didn't know. And understanding the shape of your ignorance is a different thing entirely from simply being ignorant. Somewhere around the 4th hour, Claire's voice came over the radio for the 3rd time that night. She said, quietly, that some of her crew were showing signs of significant stress, and she asked Victor what his assessment was of whether they were in immediate danger. Victor said he had no reason to believe they were in immediate danger. Claire said she agreed with that assessment. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said that not being in immediate danger and being okay were not the same thing, and that she wanted to make sure everyone on both vessels knew the difference. Victor said he agreed. He said it simply, without qualification. Coming from Victor, that was a significant statement. The 4th hour passed into the 5th, and the sky to the east had the very first suggestion of lightening. Not dawn yet, not even pre-dawn, just that barely visible shift in the quality of darkness that the eye catches before the mind registers it. And in that almost not yet light, the shape to the south began, slowly, to move. Not toward us, away, south in the direction it had been blocking, moving at the same unhurried pace it had always moved, the displacement ridge building and then gradually fading as it put distance between itself and us. No dramatic exit, no dive, no acceleration, No final gesture of any kind. It simply chose a direction and went in it, the way something does when it has finished whatever it came to do and has no interest in ceremony. I watched it go until the displacement was too faint to track. Then I watched the water where it had been for a long time after that. Flat, empty, no trace remaining of anything. Just the ocean, dark and ordinary and enormous, doing what the ocean does when there is nothing else in it to account for. Nobody moved for a while after it was gone. Not immediately. We stood there in the not quite dawn and breathed the cold, salt air and let the silence settle. The particular silence of something being over that you had not been certain would be over. Then Victor said in a completely normal voice that we would get underway at first light. And that was all he said, and it was exactly enough. We got underway at first light, and for the entire crossing home, not one person on our vessel went below deck voluntarily unless they had to. That detail has stayed with me. We were running in reasonable conditions, wind manageable, seas moderate, a crossing that under normal circumstances would have had people rotating through the cabin for coffee and rest and meals in the ordinary rhythm of a return transit. Instead, almost everyone stayed on deck. Not by any instruction, not because Victor said to, just because being below meant losing sight of the water. And losing sight of the water meant not knowing what the water was doing. And after the previous night, nobody was willing to trade that awareness for comfort. We ran south at whatever speed each vessel could safely sustain. Victor had the route plotted before the engines were even fully warm. Every waypoint precise, the heading direct, nothing scenic or exploratory about it. I watched him at the helm in those first hours and thought about how differently he carried himself now compared to the start of the expedition. Not broken, not diminished, but fundamentally changed in some quality I kept trying to find the right word for. Eventually, I settled on recalibrated. Like a piece of precision equipment that had been exposed to conditions outside its rated range and had been adjusted to account for what it now knew about the world. Claire's vessel ran parallel to ours, slightly north, both ships moving at a pace that felt deliberate without being reckless. The radio between us stayed open, but mostly quiet. Occasionally, one of the crew members on her vessel would say something to one of ours. Nothing operational, just the small, maintaining contact communications of people who had shared something and weren't quite ready to stop sharing space, even at distance. I found that oddly comforting. The sound of other voices from the other ship, even just someone asking about fuel consumption or commenting on the cloud cover, said we were still a group, still moving together, still the same cluster of people who had stood on those decks through the night. Patrick spent most of the crossing at the stern, watching the water behind us. I joined him for a stretch in the late morning, and we stood together without talking for a long time. The wake behind the vessel was clean and white and ordinary. The ocean to the north, the direction we'd come from, looked exactly the same as any other stretch of deep water on a clear day. Gray-green, textured by wind, enormous and impersonal in the way it always was. Whatever had been in that water, it left no mark on the surface. The surface didn't care. It never does. Patrick said at some point that he'd been thinking about the circling. He said he kept coming back to it because the circling was the part his mind kept snagging on above everything else. Not the equipment damage, not the acoustic signals, not even the hours it spent blocking our heading south. The circling. He said it was the circling that implied the thing he found hardest to sit with, which was that whatever we'd encountered had taken stock of us, assessed us, made some kind of determination about what we were as a group, occupying that water, and then made decisions based on that determination. I asked him what he thought the determination had been. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said he thought we'd been found acceptable, not welcome, not interesting, just acceptable. Tolerated. The way you tolerate something that is passing through a space you consider yours, as long as it behaves within whatever limits you've set for it. And when we'd shown signs of leaving, he thought the thing to the south had been a kind of confirmation, not a threat, a confirmation. Departure acknowledged, terms met. You can go. I've thought about what Patrick said many times since, and I've never found a better framework for what happened that night. Not a scientific one, not a poetic one, not a religious one. Just Patrick's quiet, practical interpretation, offered at the stern rail of a working vessel on a gray morning at sea, delivered in the same tone he'd used to describe a weather system or a mechanical fault. Matter of fact and irreducible. The most honest account of an experience for which honesty is the only tool that works. We made port in the early evening, both vessels coming in together, running slowly through the harbor approach in the low orange light of late afternoon. I remember the smell of the harbor, diesel and rope, and the particular land smell that hits you after days offshore. Something green and warm underneath everything else. The smell of a world that has soil in it. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that smell until I was in it again, and the feeling it produced was not the ordinary relief of return. It was something rawer than that, more grateful. The kind of grateful that knows what it's grateful for. The contracting liaison met both vessels at the dock. He was a compact, efficient man named Gerald, who handled these operations with a brisk professionalism that I had always appreciated. That evening, standing on the dock in his jacket while both crews came ashore, looking the way we looked, he seemed to understand immediately that something had happened that the standard debrief structure wasn't quite designed for. He asked Victor for a preliminary summary. Victor gave him one. Equipment losses, incomplete data collection, early departure on grounds of operational safety. Gerald wrote it all down. He asked if there had been any crew injuries. Victor said no. Gerald asked if there had been any vessel damage. Victor said no. Gerald wrote that down too, and his pen moved the way a pen moves when it's recording information that doesn't tell the whole story, which is to say it moved quickly and without hesitation, because quick and unhesitating is how you handle the gap between what happened and what the form has space for. After the formal part was done, Gerald pulled Victor aside. I was close enough to hear, and Victor didn't lower his voice, which I took as permission. Gerald said he wanted to ask, off the record, what actually happened out there. Victor looked at him for a moment. Then he said the formal summary was accurate. Gerald said he understood that, but he was asking what happened. Victor said that what happened was documented in the incident file, and that the incident file was complete and accurate, and that he stood by every word in it. Gerald looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded and didn't ask again. That night, the full crew of both vessels gathered at a place near the harbor. Not formally, not arranged by anyone. People just started moving in the same direction when the practical business of docking and securing was done. The way people move when they've been through something together and aren't ready to separate yet. We sat at a long table and ordered food and drinks and talked for several hours. And the talking was not primarily about what had happened. It was about other things, about previous expeditions, about families and plans and unremarkable personal details, about anything that put ordinary life back into the foreground. But underneath all of it, running steady and unspoken below every conversation, the way the hull vibration had run below the ship in those deep water nights, was the shared knowledge of what we'd seen, and the shared understanding that most of us would never talk about it the way it deserved to be talked about, and the shared, quiet acceptance that this was probably the right decision. Claire Okafor left the table around midnight. When she said good night, she looked at me across the table for a moment, just a moment, and in that look was everything the evening's conversation had carefully avoided. Then she left, and the rest of us stayed a while longer, and eventually the table came apart in ones and twos the way tables do at the end of long nights, and I walked back to where I was staying, alone in the dark, along streets that smelled like land, and thought about the ocean, and about what it keeps, and about what it occasionally chooses to show you before it keeps it again. 2 of the crew members from Claire's vessel never went offshore again. Not that season. Not ever. I found that out months later through a mutual contact, and when I heard it, I wasn't surprised, not even slightly, which told me something about how deeply that week had settled into all of us, in ways we hadn't fully measured yet. I went back to work. That's the honest answer to the question of what I did afterward. I took a few weeks, dealt with the practical side of the early return, and then signed on to another contract with a different team on different grounds. I told myself that was the healthy thing to do, that returning to the work was the correct way to process what had happened, that the ocean was still the ocean, that one encounter in one stretch of deep water didn't redefine everything I knew about my profession. I told myself that, and I mostly believed it, and I went back out. But things were different in ways I couldn't have predicted and couldn't fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. Small things, mostly. I started paying attention to the water differently. Not with fear, exactly. More like the way you pay attention to a neighborhood after something unexpected has happened in it, with a slight but permanent shift in what you're looking for, what you're assuming, what you're prepared for. I noticed depth differently. I noticed the sound the hull made in deep water differently. I noticed the quality of silence on a calm night offshore in a way I never had before, because I now knew what that silence was covering. I also noticed on every expedition for the next several years that I always checked the southern heading last thing before I slept. Always. I didn't plan it. I didn't decide to do it. I just always ended up at a porthole or on deck, looking south before I turned in, and standing there for a moment before going below. I never said anything about it to any crew. It would have been impossible to explain without telling the whole story, and I wasn't ready to tell the whole story for a very long time. Victor Hale retired from operational deep water work within a year of the expedition. He didn't announce it dramatically. He simply declined the next contract that came through the same firm, and then the one after that. And within a few months, the message was clear enough that people stopped sending them. I heard from a colleague who knew him socially that he'd taken up landscape work, gardening on a large scale, the kind that keeps you close to the ground and as far from open water as the geography of your life allows. I thought about calling him. I never did. There are people you share an experience with that is large enough that trying to talk about it in a normal telephone conversation feels like putting something vast into a jar that's too small, and you both know the jar will break, and so you don't try. Claire Okafor. I did stay in contact with, sporadically, over the years, cards at the end of the year, occasional messages when something in the news touched on deep water marine research. We never discussed the expedition directly in any of those communications. What we did do was maintain the connection, and I think for both of us the connection itself was the point. It said, without words, that the other person still existed, still remembered, still held the same knowledge in the same private way. That was enough. That was actually quite a lot. About 3 years after the expedition, I came across a reference in a research archive I was using for an unrelated project. A brief account from a commercial deep-water operation in roughly the same geographic area, written roughly 40 years before our expedition. The language was older, the format different, the technical details of a different era. But the pattern it described was immediately recognizable. Equipment losses of unknown cause, acoustic disturbances logged and filed without adequate explanation, a large presence tracked at depth over multiple days, and a final night during which the crew reported something surfacing near the vessel and positioning itself between the ship and its homeward heading before, eventually, withdrawing. The account was 2 pages. The conclusion section was 3 sentences. It said the incident was attributed to unusual marine animal activity, that no definitive identification of the species involved was possible, and that the grounds had been avoided by that particular operation for the remainder of the season. 3 sentences. The ocean had done this before, to other people, in the same water, and those people had filed it away in the same careful, contained language. And the knowledge had sat in an archive for 40 years, and I had stumbled across it while looking for something else entirely. I sat with that document for a long time. I made a copy. I still have it in a folder with the notes I wrote during the expedition, and the charts we used, and a few other pieces of paper that I've accumulated over the years, whenever something related to those grounds surfaced in a source I happened to be using. The folder isn't thick, but it exists, and every item in it describes a variation of the same experience, in the same water, across a span of time that is long enough to make the word coincidence feel genuinely inadequate. The oldest reference I found was not a formal document at all. It was a translated excerpt from an account written by an open-boat fisherman working those waters in a period so far back that the vessels he described had no engine, no radio, nothing between the crew and the open ocean but the boat itself and their own skill. He described several nights during which something large circled the fishing grounds, damaged equipment in ways he couldn't account for, and then, on the last night, blocked the southern passage home until dawn. He wrote that his crew had waited and watched, and that at dawn the thing had gone, and they had gone immediately after it, and they had not returned to those grounds. He wrote one more line after that, which the translator had rendered into plain, modern language without embellishment. He wrote that the deep water has its own rules, and those rules have nothing to do with the needs of the people crossing it, and the only sensible response to being reminded of that fact is to go home and not forget it. I read that line and put the paper down and thought about Victor at his garden, and Patrick at his stern rail, and Claire and her notebook, and Joel asleep on the deck in the middle of the night because his body had found the only exit available. I thought about all of us standing in the dark watching something enormous hold its position between us and home. I thought about the feeling of that, which has never fully left me, and which I suspect now never will. And I thought about how that fisherman, in a boat with no engine, in a time before anyone on that water had a radio or a chart or any of the technology we'd taken with us and still found useless, had arrived at exactly the same understanding in exactly the same words. The deep water has its own rules. The only sensible response is to go home and not forget it. Some knowledge is so old it stops being about the people who hold it and starts being about the place itself. That stretch of water northwest of everything, that specific, cold, deep, dark geography, has been teaching people the same lesson for longer than anyone alive can trace. And the lesson is always the same. And the lesson is always received the same way, which is in the body, in the dark, in the hours before dawn, standing on a deck watching something you cannot name hold the southern horizon until it decides you have learned enough. Last year I found a new entry in a marine incident database that I check occasionally out of old habit. A survey vessel, the same general area. Equipment losses described as consistent with large marine animal interference. Crew returned to port ahead of schedule, citing operational safety concerns. Filed and closed. I read it twice. Then I closed the screen and sat for a while in the particular way you sit when something confirms what you already knew but hoped had somehow changed. It hadn't changed. Of course it hadn't changed. The thing I encountered in that water doesn't change on a human timeline. It was old when that open boat fisherman wrote his account centuries ago, and it was old when I stood on that deck watching it hold the southern horizon. And it is still old now, still in that deep, cold water, still doing whatever it does between encounters, still operating on a scale of time that makes our expeditions and our incident reports and our careful professional language feel about as significant as a brief change in the weather. I'm 68 years old. I have a bad left knee and unreliable hearing, and a house I've lived in for 3 decades, and I spend most of my time now doing things that have nothing to do with the ocean. I cook, I read, I talk to my daughter on the phone more than I used to. I grow tomatoes in the summer with limited success and considerable stubbornness. I am, by most measures, an ordinary retired man living an ordinary retired life. And most of the people I interact with week to week have no idea that I carry this particular knowledge inside me the way you carry an old injury. Not constantly painful, but always present, always part of how you move through the world. The thing I've thought about most in the years since is not the fear. The fear was real, and it was significant, and I don't want to minimize it. But fear fades, or it gets filed somewhere that makes it manageable. And what doesn't fade, what has never once diminished in the decades since, is the feeling of having been assessed, of having been looked at, measured, and found acceptable within a set of terms I never agreed to and don't fully understand. That feeling is the part that stays permanently. The understanding that there was something out there large enough and aware enough to make a determination about us, and that we went home because it allowed us to go home, and that permission is not the same as safety. And we confused the two because we needed to, and because there was nothing else available. I've told this story to 3 people in 50 years. My wife, who listened carefully and said she believed me and never brought it up again, which was exactly the right response. A colleague about 15 years after the expedition, over a long dinner, who listened and then said he thought I'd had a rare encounter with a still unclassified deep-water species, and that the behavioral patterns were remarkable, but not necessarily evidence of what I was implying. And I thanked him for that because it was a kind thing to offer, even if neither of us believed it fully. And a young researcher I met at a professional gathering maybe 10 years ago, who was studying acoustic phenomena in deep offshore environments, who asked me, after I'd shared a small part of the story, whether I'd ever felt that the thing was intelligent in the way that word normally means. I thought about that question for a long moment. Then I said I didn't know whether intelligent was the right word, because intelligent implies a kind of thinking that we recognize because we do it ourselves. What I felt out there wasn't that kind of recognition. It was something more like the feeling you get when you realize the space you're occupying belongs to someone else entirely. Someone who was there long before you arrived and will be there long after you've gone, and who has their own relationship with that space that has nothing to do with you and never did. Whether that's intelligence in the way we mean it, I can't say. But it's something very old and very present and very much its own thing. That researcher nodded slowly and wrote something in her notebook. I don't know what she wrote. I hope it was useful to her. I hope some part of what I told her finds its way into work that treats these waters seriously, that treats the documented anomalies seriously, that doesn't immediately reach for the nearest comfortable explanation and file the rest away, because the rest is the part that matters. Now I want to finish the way I started, which is plainly. I was 26 years old when that expedition ended. I am 68 now. In the 42 years between those 2 points, I have worked in deep water, raised a family, lost my wife, watched friends age and go, and built the kind of ordinary life that looks from the outside like the whole story. But the whole story has that week in it, that specific stretch of cold, deep, dark ocean. Those 7 days of something in the water learning what we were, and us learning, incompletely and permanently, what we were not. Here's what I believe after 50 years of sitting with it. We treat the deep ocean as a resource, a route, a research environment, a place we go to extract things and measure things and understand things on our terms. We go in with our equipment and our protocols and our incident report forms and our professional language, and we believe, in some fundamental way, that we are in charge of the interaction, that we set the terms, that our presence is the active thing and everything else is the passive context around it. What I know from 7 days in those waters is that this belief is a convenience, not a fact. The ocean doesn't share it. Whatever lives in its deep places doesn't share it. We are not in charge of anything out there. We are visitors operating under a tolerance we didn't earn and can't negotiate. And most of the time that tolerance holds, and we come home and write our reports and believe we managed the situation. And occasionally, in certain deep and specific waters, something very old and very large looks up from wherever it lives and notices us and reminds us of the actual arrangement. We are guests. We have always been guests. We just rarely get shown the terms clearly enough to feel them. Here's the question I want to leave you with, the one I've never been able to fully answer myself. If something out there is old enough to be in every account across every generation of people who have worked those waters, and aware enough to track multiple vessels and manage its position relative to both of them simultaneously, and deliberate enough to block a heading and then release it at a moment of its own choosing, then what exactly are we calling it when we write unknown marine animal in the incident file and close the folder? What are we actually saying when we choose that language? And more importantly, What are we choosing not to say? Think about that. And if this account did something to you, if it got into you the way this kind of truth gets into a person, leave a comment and tell me what you think is really out there. And if you want more stories told this plainly and this honestly, subscribe and leave a like. It helps more than you know. And there is more where this came from.